Hey guys, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. My name's Dina. I am the Assistant Events Coordinator at the Center on Rights Development. Welcome to our 14th Annual Symposium on Human Rights. This year's theme is the right to education, so tonight we will be discussing inequalities in U.S. education. So thank you for coming, and thank you to our distinguished speakers. We're so happy to have you. I will first introduce Professor Destray, and he will introduce our panelists. So Professor Destray is the director of the International Human Rights Program at the Center on Rights Development Human Trafficking Clinic at the Joseph Corvell School. He's also the Buddhist chaplain at the University of Denver. He's a graduate of Harvard Divinity School, where he studied comparative religion and was appointed the first Buddhist chaplain by the Dalai Lama. He's a graduate of the Northeastern University School of Law, where he focused on critical legal studies and prisoners' rights. Before coming to the University of Denver, he was the U.S. Attorney's Office. He worked at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington. So, welcome, Professor Destray.
So, welcome everyone. A special thanks, and I'm going to butcher my German, to my Wunderbelligschaft, for those of you who know your German. So, does it mean something to you, Andy? Cool. All right. Okay. So, welcome everyone. My name is Claude Destray again, and it's my pleasure to have the second evening and second panel on our 14th annual CORD Symposium. I've said this before in some other events that we've had, is that when I teach my course on international law and human rights, one of the things I ask people to list in order of preference, their hierarchy of human rights. And we know that there are about 50 sort of co-equal ones out there, but the reality is that we all have our preference. We all have our hierarchy, individually, as communities, as nations. And interesting enough, every time I do this experiment with the students in the class, as I force them to put them in hierarchical order, they always put the right to education first. Now, that might be because of the amount of money you're all paying for your education, but that's actually something to be considered, because this is where you are right now. This is what you're thinking about. This is where you're putting your resources. So not surprisingly, it would be at the top of your list in terms of what you consider an essential human right. I mean, it came ahead of the right to life, the right to food, the right to everything, the right to an education. So I'm really pleased that we are focusing on that this year. As some of you know, the Center on Rights Development is one of the oldest centers here at the Corvell School. What makes it unique is that while it's a professional educational center, it's run entirely by students and coordinated and organized by students. I am often reminded I'm a third wheel in the organization, and my staff has been known not to tell me where they're having staff meetings on a regular basis. So really, as a mere professor, unnecessary for the proper running of the Center on Rights Development. Thank you, Andy, and all involved. It focuses on our what we call our founding document of one of the least known of the International Bill of Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as the document that we use to try to advocate for, to explain, to do research on, and to try to educate the public about. And the right to education, of course, is part and parcel of the ICESCR. I think it's interesting this evening that the title is Gaps and Gains, Bridging Educational Inequality in the U.S. And I invite you on your way out to grab, just today, got one of these letters that those of us who are parents in the DPS, the Denver Public School System, gets from occasionally from Tom, the superintendent, Osberg. It says at the top, improving Colorado's dismal track record on school funding. And it starts as follows. We all know that Colorado is a terrific place to live and raise a family. We're consistently at the top of the rankings in terms of the healthiest, fastest growing, and most prosperous states in the nation. But when it comes to investing in our kids, their education, and our future, we are at the other end of the rankings. In terms of per-student funding for education, Colorado has consistently fallen near the bottom of the list, with fewer than half of the per-student dollars in states' fundings for K-12 students that a number of East Coast states invest in their students. Likewise, Colorado is near the bottom nationally in the size of our achievement gaps between white students and students of color. We can't continue these trends if we want to ensure a bright future for our community and our state. And then he goes through explaining some new legislation that he hopes will change some of that. And he ends, or partially ends, near the end, he said, statewide, we are still struggling with educational funding cuts of the last 4 years. Denver, for example, receives $800 per student, or more than $60 million overall less than we did 4 years ago in state funding. So while the problem is international, we can also say it's clearly present here. My son goes to Denver School of Science and Technology, and his school, which is at Colorado Heights, or now used to be Colorado, on South Federal, 95% of the students are on funded lunch. As we know, in Denver Public Schools, 38% of students who go to Denver Public Schools only get 1 meal per day. And that's usually the lunch that they get while they are there. So the issues are both international and domestic. So I think it's interesting to note that obviously the superintendent of schools recognizes exactly the kinds of things that our panelists are going to be speaking about this evening. So we're going to begin with my introductions of the panelists. Each one will have 20 minutes, and I will be the timekeeper over here and hold up my fancy, or not so fancy, 5-minute, 2-minute warning. I don't want to even describe what happens after 2 minutes on the last 2-minute warnings. It's an unpleasant experience, so just fair warning. So in order, we'll start with Dr. Wood, followed by Professor Kitchen, and then Drew Daniels. So Dr. Douglas Wood is a program officer at the Forum Foundation and works on higher education issues with an emphasis on the need of students from poor and marginalized communities in the United States. His grant-making focuses on helping students transition from high school to college and improving the college completion rates of underserved students. He brings to this position a broad experience in PK through 12 as well as higher education policy and administration. Prior to joining the foundation in 2011, Dr. Wood was Associate Dean of Administration and Planning at the Eugene Lang College of the New School for Liberal Arts. And during the 10 years before coming to the foundation, he also worked as an Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Tennessee State Board of Education, served as a member of the Tennessee Higher Education Commission, and was Executive Director and Principal Investigator of the National Academy of Excellent Teaching, an institute of the Teachers College at Columbia University. Dr. Wood began his career as a public school teacher. After 5 years of teaching, he worked as a research assistant at Harvard University, the Center for Collaborative Education in Metro Boston, and the Annenberg Rural Challenge, among others. He then served as a course assistant at Harvard's JFK School of Government and a teaching fellow at Harvard's Graduate School of Education. Dr. Wood, we have an alma mater in common, so just want you to know. He holds his Ed.D. and Ed.M. in Administration, Planning, and Social Policy from Harvard University, a master's degree in English from Middlebury College, and a bachelor's in History from Warford College, where he's a member of Phi Beta Kappa. Following Dr. Wood will be Professor Kitchen, who is the Kennedy Endowed Chair in Urban Education and Professor at the Department of Education, Research, Policy, and Practice at the University of Denver's Mortgage College of Education, right here. And his research interests include diversity and equity in mathematics education, school reform at urban schools, formative assessment of English language learners, and history of education in the U.S. Prior to joining the Mortgage College faculty in the fall of 2012, Dr. Kitchen was a professor of leadership and mathematics education at the University of New Mexico, where he held a dual position in the Education Leadership Degree Program and the Department of Mathematics and Statistics. At UNM, Dr. Kitchen was the co-principal investigator of the Center for Mathematics Education of Latinos that was funded through the National Science Foundation, the Center for Learning and Teaching, part of the NSF. He was also the co-principal investigator of the Hewlett-Packard Company-funded High Achieving Schools Initiative, and he is the co-editor of 3 books, initiated and served as editor of Todos, Mathematics for All Research Monograph, and has worked nationally and internationally with numerous schools. Dr. Kitchen graduated from East High School I'm pleased to say that's where my son is right now, as a junior, and started his teaching career at the Denver Public Schools and the B.F. Kitchen Elementary School in Loveland, Colorado, is named after his grandfather. Did you ever think of teaching there? No. No. Okay, just curious.
I'm not sure they'd let me.
They let you in? Okay. Finally, we will hear from June Daniels, who is Executive Director of Education Innovation Laboratory at Harvard University. Prior to joining EdLabs, Ms. Daniels practiced corporate law with Mayer Brown and Platt in Chicago and Greenberg Traurig in Boston, where her practice concentrated in mergers and acquisitions for mid-market corporations and in the representation of venture capital firms. So then she saw the light, clearly. I had to say that. It doesn't say that here, by the way. There's a little space between that and the next sentence, and so I knew that that's what she wanted me to say. So, but it does say, wanting to indulge her passion for education, Ms. Daniels became counsel to the Providence Public School Board and School Department, where she served until she came to EdLabs. So I could see that this was transition. It wasn't, you didn't go cold turkey, obviously. This is good at being you know, a recovering lawyer myself. I understand how that works. She received her Juris Doctor from University of Chicago, her Master's in Business Administration from the University of Florida, where she was named the Matherly Scholar, and her Bachelor of Science in Economics from Vanderbilt University. Her pro bono practice has included acting as chairman of the board of Quest Montessori School, as the strategic consultant to the Federal Hill House Association's Early Learning Program, and as legal counsel to Minority Investment Development Corporation. Among other activities, Ms. Daniels also enjoys lecturing on both business and legal issues. So with that, I will turn it over to my esteemed colleagues. And so we will start on that end of the table.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I hope this works. Well, it's such a pleasure to be here today, and it's such an honor to be here with these great panelists. And I am really thrilled to be here because I remember reading about this place and this wonderful university when I finished reading Madam Secretary, which is one of my favorite books, and the marvelous impact that Professor Corbell's had on so many people, particularly one of our former Secretaries of State and Ford Fellow, Condoleezza Rice. So I feel really connected to this place, and it's such a pleasure and honor to be here. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this issue of how the Ford Foundation is trying to address the notion of bridging the gaps of inequality in higher education and in education in general. Just quickly about the foundation, we are the second largest foundation in the world, behind the Gates Foundation. We were the largest for the first 65 years of our existence, and now we're the second largest. We have approximately $13 billion in assets, and we give away about $600 billion a year. We have our main offices in New York and offices in Mexico and South America and Egypt and Nairobi and Kenya and Egypt and Indonesia and India and China. In fact, the former Secretary of the Treasury, Tim Geithner's father, opened our China office, and President Obama's mother was our program officer in Indonesia. So it's a marvelous opportunity to work at the Ford Foundation. So when I came to the foundation, my predecessor, of course, is Dr. Anderson, Gregory Anderson, and we had not had a program officer in higher education at the foundation for 2.5 years. And so what happened during that time was, as you know, when you don't have someone really advocating for a program, things sort of shifts. And we were actually the lowest funded initiative in the foundation below Religion and Society. Religion Society is great, but we were right below it. And so it really gave me an opportunity to really rebuild the program. I was asked by our president, our vice president, and our director to completely revamp the program, which I tried to do, which I'm going to show you a little bit about that today. I interviewed 327 people all over the United States, including all of our grantees, university professors, university deans and presidents, community college presidents. I also interviewed members of higher education boards and commissions, legislators, current and former governors, and also focus groups of students and parents. And when I did an analysis of all of that, and also doing analysis of the last 50 years of the Ford Foundation's investments in higher education, we decided we'd bring the program back to focusing on first-generation low-income college students, and really trying very hard to help support first-generation low-income college students to get a high-quality post-secondary credential, with a particular focus on immigrants, veterans, the incarcerated, and the formerly incarcerated. And so that's what this first pillar of work is about. We're calling Corridors of College Success. So I'm going to run through this first pillar, then we'll talk a little bit about the second pillar, and then I'll talk a little bit about the third pillar. So our initiative goal is to increase the attainment of high-quality post-secondary credentials by vulnerable low-income students, particularly immigrants, veterans, incarcerated, and recently released sex offenders who are first in their families to attend 2- and 4-year colleges. Among vulnerable students who enroll in community colleges, 6% need remedial courses and only 23% complete an AA within 5 years. So we decided to really focus on community colleges within these corridors because a large number of them actually attend community colleges. Low income. 64% of students attending a for-profit college are low income, with 60% receiving private loans and 43% defaulting in 2010. As many of you know, student loan debt stands at over $1 trillion, surpassing credit card and auto loan debt. Immigrant origin youth represent 30% of all low-income youth.
My family brought me from San Pedro Sula, Honduras when I was 4 years old. I learned English in 5 months and graduated high school with a grade point average of 3.8. Due to the immigration laws in my state, I have not been able to go to college. I'm working and working, but it feels like it's toward nothing.
I came from Medellin, Colombia 12 years ago. Going back isn't a choice because I only have a 3rd grade reading level in Spanish.
This should not be of any surprise to you, and what we're very excited about is we've invested heavily in Together Colorado, a metro organization for people here in Colorado, and we're very proud of the fact of public education around the asset bill that was passed this year. So I'm very thrilled about that. And let me also say that we'll continue to do that all over the country. We'll continue to invest in comprehensive immigration reform, working with our Immigration and Migration Rights Initiative, which is in our Equality and Justice unit. So this is a huge priority for the foundation. Veterans. 37.9% of veterans ages 18 to 24 are unemployed. I just want you to keep that in your head.
Covering the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, you spend a lot of time with young soldiers barely out of high school who are asked to do the toughest work the country asks of them. Back on base, they prepare for a transition to civilian life. A generous GI Bill with billions of dollars for education is designed to ease their way. Here, soldiers take college courses from a variety of schools. earning credits towards a hoped-for degree.
Transfer over to Strayer.
It's one of those for-profit, mostly online colleges. Last year, I investigated the for-profit sector. At that time, it was a $6 billion a year industry with little government oversight. Our report focused on the lengths schools go to attract students,
Are you thinking about going back to school?
their accreditation problems, and the staggering amounts of student debt. More than a third of all GI Bill dollars are ending up at for-profit colleges. It's a disproportionate share, and it appears to be growing. Frontline acquired telephone recordings of recruiters from Westwood College, a for-profit school based in Denver, Colorado.
I get excited when I have military students because, you know, they have the discipline, they have the drive, they have the motivation.
The recruiters tell the military applicants they'll receive special treatment.
Oh yeah, we're on military.com as a military-friendly school.
And share job and salary prospects.
Right out of the gate, it looks like you have the ability to make anywhere between $72,000 to $82,000.
It was a Westwood recruiter who told Jason Longmore, a Navy vet, that he could earn a bachelor's degree in just 3 years. But 6 months into his program, he learned from a prospective employer that his Westwood degree wasn't worth much. And when Longmore went to transfer to a state school, his credits were no good. We asked Westwood about this, and they told us they never made any promises about credits. They pointed out Longmore had initialed a box that read, "Westwood College makes no guarantee of credit transfer."
Me and my wife both asked multiple times, does that mean that their credits don't transfer? He said, don't worry, everything will transfer. We have to put that in there because every college has credits that won't transfer, so it has to be in there, it's fine. If they would have told me directly that they wouldn't transfer, I would not have gone to Westwood College.
Ex-offenders. 2.3 million people are incarcerated, the highest in the world. Most are in our communities with few good options.
The graduation ceremony in upstate New York went off with the usual pomp this spring, but the circumstances, out of the box. The 43 degrees granted that day were from Bard. This rite of passage, however, took place in a maximum security prison. The grads, convicted felons, who for now can only hang the diplomas in their cells.
What we would do was rob the drug dealers. So the drug dealers, you know, they do all the work, and then we combine and take the money at the end of the day.
In 1991, during a shootout, Cardinalis killed a man.
Another question.
While he served time, Bard initiated and helped staff a privately funded BA program that Cardinalis signed up for. Total enrollment is now up to 250. Bard College is highly selective, admitting only 30% of applicants. Bard behind bars is far pickier, with an admissions rate rivaling Harvard's, says the program's founder, Max Kemp.
Those students that are most intellectually ambitious, that are most curious, are so often the same people as children who dropped out of conventional school the youngest.
Kyle Alston didn't learn to read or write until prison. He got an associate's degree from Bard.
Each time that I was incarcerated before in the past, I was always looking for the easy way out, some program that I could try to get out of prison so that I could just go back and hang around the same neighborhood and do the same things that I did that led me here this time. This time I'm committed to bettering myself and to educating myself.
Carlos Rosado, sentenced to 16 years for robbery and assault, majored in environmental studies at Woodbury. He has gotten out, is now gainfully employed as a recycling engineer. Almost everyone on the outside has a job, suggesting a prison BA can be the ticket.
But it begins with two things. It begins with the person identifying that they need or they want to excel. And you need an opportunity to excel.
So here's our theory of change. We're interested in place-based college success proof points, and these are the places that we're going to be working in, including the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and Roxbury, and Denver, as you see on your map. And our strategies and tactics: build public and political will, support and sustain reforms, communicate compelling ideas and evidence, support and lift up proof points, build upon existing place-based college success initiatives, focus on raising standards in community colleges with practices that meet educational needs. And we have specific state policy outcomes that we're interested in. One is really focused on removing financial barriers, developing outcomes-based funding formulas that pay explicit attention to the performance of underserved students, supporting universal community college transfer pathways between 2- and 4-year institutions, regulating for-profit and proprietary institutions, and developing and supporting partnerships with departments of corrections and local colleges. And our federal policy outcomes. Really focused on financial barriers being removed. Again, Pell Grant eligibility is sustained for low-income students. Institutional eligibility for federal student financial aid is tied to standards. And again, regulating public and private student loan industries and modifying the 90-10 rule, which is really specific to veterans, and enacting more payment options for private loans. Going to scale. We hope that momentum from state policy reform in these targeted states will also enable us to influence other federal policies from the local level to the state to the federal level in these corridors of college success, so that we have the place-based college success programs, state policy outcomes, federal policy outcomes, and then making these proof points more available across the country. So our impact that we look for is that 2- and 4-year colleges in the U.S. provide vulnerable students post-secondary education that is affordable, that is accountable, and that is valuable. Now, I have 5 minutes, so let me quickly show you a little bit of the other pillar that we have.
6 minutes.
Oh, good, 6.
I'll use one of those.
Okay. Second pillar, fellowships for social justice. Now, we've talked a little about corridors of college success, fellowships for justice. Social justice research in the public sphere is the third one, and we're investing in students to be able to work with senior faculty members to think very strategically about how to get their social justice research out into the public sphere using social and new media and conventional media. Our biggest success so far has been around Stop and Frisk in New York. And this is on fellowships for social justice. We have 2 programs, the Ford Fellowship Program, which is in its 51st year, which helps to focus on making sure graduate students help to diversify the university professorate. And our newest, which is our Public Interest Law Fellowships, where students will have a chance to intern for 10 weeks in social justice organizations in 80 Ford grantee organizations all over the world. This is 3 minutes.
I can who I am without the Ford Foundation Fellowship.
It's changed my life. I was a dissertation fellow in 1996, and when I got that fellowship, I was in this uncertainty. Is this where I want to go to? And do I do other things? You have other opportunities. And coming to the conference of the Ford Fellows, it really inspired me to go on.
It provides individuals that you can trust.
It meant that I had access to a group of people who may have had similar background experiences.
That I wasn't alone. Even though I was the only person in my institution, or that I knew in my institution, I knew there were others out there.
The Ford Fellowship Program is about creating community.
Where you meet many different kinds of people and you establish relationships over the years. And then when you need something later, not only you already have kind of a friend, you have someone you can trust.
It was clear to us that Ford wanted us not only to go off to some wonderful Ivy League and do well for ourselves personally, but in fact to go back home to our region and have a broader sense of impact.
There's a commitment, I think, everybody who gets a fellowship has, that is to share what they have learned with others.
I can replicate some of the experiences I've had as a Ford Fellow for the students of color that I mentor.
And I think it's important to both model for young people of color what the possibilities are for them, but also to help white students understand what it means to be an ally.
I do see myself as a mentor. I'm in an engineering field. There are not many minorities, there are not many women. Yet you go to my lab and it's all minorities and all women.
At the University of Michigan, I'm probably trained in social media sciences more students of color than any other individual person.
There's nothing wrong with the human capital in a minority population, The difference is having opportunity to fulfill it.
And the last minute, this is a timeline of 50 years of investment. Fellowships for undergraduates, beginning at the height of the Civil Rights Movement in 62 to 66, we moved to fellowships for graduate students in our advanced study program for those faculty in HBCUs. We officially changed it to the doctoral program, expanded to include Mexican American, Native American, Puerto Rican faculty in 1970. In 1971, both programs were folded to be named graduate fellowship programs aimed at addressing the severe underrepresentation of ethnic and racial minorities in the United States professorate. In 1979, the foundation provided grants to the National Academy of Sciences for the administration of the Ford Foundation Diversity Fellowships. In 2005, the programs were replaced by Ford Foundation Fellowships, broadening eligibility. So it had nothing to do with race or ethnicity. 2012, we celebrated our 50th anniversary. 5,000 scholars have received fellowships across 900 colleges and universities in the behavioral and social sciences, humanities, life sciences, physical sciences, mathematics, engineering, and education. And our eligibility criteria will be re-examined this year because in 2014, because we will allow DACA students who are eligible for DACA, to be able to apply for these awards. And we will offer senior fellowships that will also be added. It's great to have former fellows like Professor Rice and Cornel West and Kofi Annan, but there's other fellows that you haven't heard of. For example, a fellow who got his fellowship in 1987 at the height of the AIDS epidemic, who has helped to contribute to the development of a little tablet called a tripla. And a tripla is a once-a-day tablet for those individuals who are suffering from HIV. It has prolonged the lives of literally hundreds of thousands of people all over the United States. And what if that kid who came from Mexico, immigrated from Mexico, had not had the opportunity to get a fellowship at the Ford Foundation and to do his postdoctoral research? Where would many of us be at that point across the world who are suffering with HIV and AIDS? And finally, the Public Interest Law Fellowships. I mentioned this to you before, and this just gives you a sense of where those students are in terms of the organizations that fell into that program. So most of them fall under our DRJ unit, which is our Democracy, Rights, and Justice unit, and the rest fall under our Assets unit and our ECX unit. So that just gives you a taste of our programs at the Ford Foundation across 3 pillars. Corridors of college success, trying to strengthen linkages with K-12, higher education, workforce, really focused on vulnerable students. Pillar number 2, really have an opportunity to give students who are in pre-dissertation, dissertation, and postdoc fellows and senior fellowships who are working on social justice issues across the country. And also to invest in public interest law fellowships so those students who may be a judge one of these days can have the experience of having worked in a progressive social justice organization that is on the front lines of doing this work across the world. That is our answer, and I'll say it out loud, to the Federalist Society. And then the 3rd pillar, which is our social, this is speaking as a Republican, and our 3rd pillar, which of course is on our social justice research in the public sphere, which is our most exciting and nascent program. That's it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. When it's all hooked up.
No. You mean aside from this?
A woman after my own heart. I never use this. Every time I try, there's a massive failure.
Mine's not nearly as pretty, though. It's very interesting.
Look good for a second.
There it is. Very good.
First picture.
Well, hi, everyone. How are you? It's such a pleasure. I want to echo Dr. Wood and just tell you what a great privilege it is to be here. I have great respect for this school. And I know that I'm talking to very important people here. It's just a privilege to be here with you, so thank you very much. And I know, just talking to a few of you prior to the presentation, I really respect the work that many of you are doing and intend to do, so again, thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a research project that I led, and it was focused on issues around achievement and achievement gaps in particular. We focused on mathematics, but we focused on schools in general and strategies that schools are using nationally to close the achievement gap. Just to give you a short overview nationally, we know that typically there are exemplary schools nationally that are closing the achievement gap and doing exemplary work in this area. Typically, though, these schools sort of have their moment in the sun, so to speak. It usually lasts a very short period of time, and then they tend to migrate back towards mediocrity. And the research literature on this has been very clear for years and years and years. So when we initiated this work, it's been a decade ago now, with Hewlett-Packard Corporation as the funder, and also a heavy hitter to get us out in the field, we knew that this would be challenging work. We also knew that there were very few examples, particularly at the secondary level. There are more examples at the elementary school level. So if you go to Education Trust into their website, you'll see that many examples of elementary schools closing the achievement gap and so forth. Secondary schools tend to be, there's very few examples, and our study is one of the few that's been done in the last decade in this area and has garnered a lot of attention for that reason, just because, again, so few examples. We started with 231 applicants to be part of this project, schools that applied, who were essentially doing just amazing things. Schools, they had to have at least 50% free reduced lunch, and they had to have sustained or significant academic achievement for 3 to 5 years across the board, not just mathematics, but across the board. We went from 231 to just 9 schools. They were distributed across the country, none in Colorado. The closest to Colorado was actually El Paso. And I'll talk a little bit about Isleta Middle School, if you know that particular area of the country. As part of the research, and I won't go through all the methodology just because I don't want to bore you to death, I want to get to the heart of this thing. We went to the schools and visited them twice during the academic year and spent a week at each one of them. We did a lot of classroom visits, a lot of interviews, and as part of that, we interviewed students, which was very interesting, and I'll tell you more about that. But we got a chance to really spend significant time with teachers, with administrators, students. We actually had parents come out to meet with us voluntarily to tell us what made their schools so special, and that was quite a treat, to say the least. Let me give you a little bit more historic background on this. Research has consistently shown that students from more affluent communities have access to higher quality educational opportunities, and much more so than kids living in areas of poverty. We know that instead of stressing sort of critical thinking skills, high-level thinking, that schools that serve the poor tend to focus on skill-based instruction, worksheets, that kind of thing, memorization of facts, and it's not just in mathematics. We've known this for years. This database goes back decades now. We also know that schools that serve the poor tend to have, the facilities aren't nearly as nice for the most part. Again, these are generalizations, but we've seen this in the research for years. Higher percentages of novice teachers, teachers without a teaching credential, and teachers who have neither a major or a minor in the subject that they are teaching. These schools tend to be highly bureaucratic. They tend to be standardized and coordinated instructional programs, tend to foster sort of a custodial approach to students, more of a babysitting approach, high discipline, that type of thing. So in our study, after spending literally, we had just mounds of data, and we spent months and months and months going through this data. Very interesting process of trying to make sense of what we were seeing, what we were hearing, and what we found were 3 predominant themes, big level themes. The first one, challenging mathematical content and high-level instruction were what we saw at these schools. They focus on problem solving and sense making as opposed to just rote instruction. We also saw high expectations, but that was coupled with sustained support for academic excellence. One of the things we hear a lot of in educational reform is that we have to have high expectations. Many teachers, unfortunately, do not have high expectations, especially for students of color or students living in poverty. And the other piece, though, that's often missing is what about support? What about support for students to learn at high levels? So that piece we found was something we saw at the schools. And then finally, the importance of building relationships. I'll talk briefly about each one now, and also just share a few quotes from participants in our study. The first one, challenging content, high-level instruction. We found that this was something that predominated across the schools, not just in mathematics, but in all the classrooms that we were privileged to observe. This is not a minor finding, okay? I've spent, as you saw in the intro, I've spent a lot of time in schools across this country and in the world, and oftentimes see, especially in inner city schools, especially in poor rural schools, worksheets, a lot of students sitting individually, not working together, not getting support for learning, that type of thing. So seeing this across these schools was very exciting. Also, this intense focus on student learning at participating schools. So let me give you a story, first story. Stories are always a powerful way to sort of relate, the types of things that we saw at a school, Lata High School in South Carolina, a school that was predominantly African American at the time, championship basketball team. So they were the state champions in basketball the year before we visited the school. They actually, despite the fact that they had this amazing basketball program, their administration had made a decision to work with other schools in the school district or the schools they competed with to schedule sporting events later in the day, like in the evening or just on the weekends. Reason? Because if learning is your top priority, then everything you do at the school is structured so that learning is the focus. Now that may seem like an obvious, well, duh, of course, but in fact, many of you may remember in high school, learning is oftentimes not the primary focus in high school. Lots has been written about this in the United States. High schools have many priorities, like sports, okay, like socializing students for whatever the next step in life might be, vocational, preparing them vocationally, whatever it is. But learning, and especially at a high level, is oftentimes not the focus. Scheduling then, when you begin to think this way, you begin to structure the school day differently. Okay, so for example, many of you may remember that assemblies are something that happened a lot. You'd show up for an assembly on who knows what, right? And oftentimes, and kids get excited because they know it's time that nothing's really happening, right? You just goof around, you sit with your friends, right? You share notes or whatever you do. And assemblies were something that these schools almost entirely terminated, okay? Interruptions during class, no announcements, for example. Bells sometimes were non-existent in these schools. Looking at the learning environment, looking at what students, the types of environments they were in. Were there a lot of distractions, like lots of, could they look outside at other kids who were goofing around outside? To that level of detail, where learning becomes the focus, everything has to change. The way you schedule the day has to change. Everything, okay? Kids were not allowed to leave early for sporting events. The cheer team was not allowed to leave early for sporting events. Just a few examples. Teachers also engaged in this backward learning process. So if you think about it, structuring a school so that learning becomes a focal point is actually a really interesting problem. How do you structure the school day so that learning becomes a focal point, especially at a school where learning has not been the focal point? It requires a complete culture change in what happens at the school. So every meeting is focused on literally, and we saw this in action, learning. How are we doing meeting our learning goals? The schools that we visited, the majority of them, literally teachers could tell you exactly what was going on, not only in their classroom for that day, at their grade level, in their subject area, but in their colleagues' classrooms as well. So all the discussions are about learning, what's going on, what are learning objectives, what's going on in your classroom, and how do we get to where we want to get. Okay, so for example, here's just a very concrete example. Algebra 1 became the focal point for every 8th grade student in the schools we visited. We were at both middle schools and high schools, but 8th grade, successful completion of Algebra 1. Now, some of you may remember, you may not have taken Algebra 1 until 9th grade or even 10th grade. All these schools made Algebra 1 a focal point at the 8th grade. The idea being that, and there's research on this, algebra is a great gatekeeper. So all students, especially females and students of color, need to have high-level, challenging algebra, because we know that when students have access to algebra, their trajectory into college tends to increase exponentially. Okay, so we make Algebra 1 a goal in 8th grade. What does that mean then for 7th grade? What does that mean for 6th grade? We have to work backwards from our goal. That's the backward learning model. And at this level that we saw at the school, it's not just sort of grand planning monthly or that kind of thing. It's day by day. And when you begin to look at it this way, 6th grade, students are coming in. This is a huge issue if you've worked in schools. They typically are coming in behind. In mathematics, nationally, students, depending on how this is defined, but typically 1 to 2 years behind in mathematics, 2 to 3 years behind in reading, especially in inner city schools or rural schools. This is pretty common, okay? So students are coming in behind in 6th grade. What you do is you double up and you teach them, at this time we call it Common Core State Standards. They're learning the mathematics at grade level, but they're also learning remedial skills that they need to get caught up. And in this model, you stop blaming the fact that the prior teachers, the prior schools didn't do their job, and you accept the students as they are and go from there. Let me tell you a little bit about high expectations and sustained support. We were at KIPP. KIPP is a school you may have heard of, KIPP Academies. They are a national model, very controversial, very strong model. They have something like 165 more contact hours with students per year. They do weekend classes, they have summer classes. It's a very intense academic model. It's very controversial, and you may want to look it up on the web. But they have had tremendous success. And this is one of the KIPP schools in Houston. This was a Hispanic teacher, male teacher, who basically said, look, we're proud if these extremely wealthy kids have all these advantages coming from wealthy, educated families. If they can do it, why can't ours? There's a lot of reasons why. The environment they're in and all this other stuff. So we have to overcome that. For me, I don't want my kids just to be above average. I want them to not only be the best, but dominating at the school that they go to next. So I want them to go in there and completely dominate. Turn to your neighbor and say, let's dominate, right? So I just love that quote, the notion, and I was in his classroom, and I can tell you that there was no off-task behavior whatsoever for an hour and 15 minutes. And I saw him teach more than once. The notion being that every single minute in these students have in the classroom is vitally important. Reason? Because historically they have been marginalized, they have been undereducated, and we have to take this problem seriously. And that was drilled in my head. I can tell you it completely changed the way I look at education. Importance of building relationships. This strong sense among faculty about the purpose, that they have a purpose here. So this was a teacher at the Young Women's Leadership School in East Harlem. I want to tell you about that school a little bit in just a minute. But she told me we spent a huge amount of time getting them, the students, to change the way they think about going to school and being in the classroom. When they start here, they are so competitive. And they won't answer questions if they feel embarrassed or they think they might not know. We spend so much time in 7th grade talking about that and talking to them and just demonstrating and making them be cooperative, even setting up the room where they have tables instead of desks. In lots of math classes, we do cooperative work and try to do things that are non-competitive in order for us to live in an all-women's world. Now, this notion, this is sort of countercultural, right? Schools are very competitive places. Maybe not Corville, but lots of schools are very competitive. And there's this sense that we're in it for ourselves. This school was just the opposite. This was part of the culture that they established for the young women they serve, was we're going to develop a cooperative way of working. The Young Women's Leadership School at the time was established one of only a handful of female schools in the entire country in a public school. There are private schools that do this. A couple quick reflections, and I know my time's getting very short. These schools were places of tangible sense of hope at these schools. Nationally, we know in the research base, this is in fact the case at these types of schools. You walk in the building, you feel something different. There's hope in these schools. These schools had slogans that they actually carried out, like failure is not an option here. They also prioritized teaching and learning. The actual strategies they used, though, varied quite a bit. So the school, Isleta Middle School in the El Paso area, they actually focused on heavy family involvement. They were the only school of the 9 that did that, and it worked for them. Finally, we met with students, and it was cathartic. I mean, these students literally told us, we go to this school because they challenge us. It went against many notions that I think many adults have, that students really don't want to work that hard in school. I don't believe that anymore. I just don't. Finally, a few just comments I want to make. Race matters in all of this. So we focused on high poverty schools. Many of these schools, so all of them except one, were also majority minority schools. And we also know from the research that middle class schools, upper middle class schools that have a high percentage of kids of color, those kids actually are being denied access to opportunities as well. Student perseverance is a critical piece in all this work. And I won't go into great detail, but this has become a focal point for me in much of my work in schools around the country, supporting students to persevere in their work. Support for struggling learners is absolutely vital in all of this. We can't have 30 kids in a class without lots of contact with adults. We need well-trained teachers, obviously everybody knows that. Finally, parental involvement. There's a sense out in the world that especially low-income parents cannot necessarily support academic work. There are projects, not a lot, but some in this country, like MAPS, demonstrating in fact that's not the case. Teachers bringing parents in, training them, and supporting them, getting them involved in this work, it can happen and can make a difference. MAPS is out of the University of Arizona. Finally, this is a photograph of the graduating class of 2003 at Yes College Prep. And you can see here from the faces the school, who the students were at the school. Yes College Prep started in a parking lot in a Houston public school. Houston, a school 10 years ago where only 3 out of the 20 high schools, essentially 3 out of 20 predominantly, is where most of the kids going on to college came from. If you look at a lot of inner city high schools, high districts I should say, very few actually have kids who go on to college. This school said, we're going to change that. Every kid who comes to school, they graduate only if they are accepted to a 4-year college. Thank you very much. Sorry I went over.
Are you going to yield your time?
Well, let me just say that I will go over. Okay. So I'm very sorry.
That's very kind.
I'm hoping this will work.
And I'm just going to pass this over to you.
Thank you. And hopefully this thing works so I don't have to. Does this thing work? Hopefully. Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. Where are we doing? I have to see this. Okay. So, hi, I'm June. I'm sorry I have to stand up. Does anybody else want to stand up? Just stand up for 1 minute. And I'll introduce myself while you're standing. How's that? So I'm June. I am the executive director at Harvard, at the Education Innovation Labs at Harvard. I'm really, really privileged to be here today. Thank you so much for the invitation. Okay, you guys can sit now. Thank you. Anybody who wants to get up, please get up. All right, I'm going to figure out how to use this. Okay, so that's apparently not how you use this. Okay, I give up. I'm going to use it. Okay, so essentially we're a lab that studies education. I'm only going to show you one aspect of what we do. That aspect is the turnaround work that we work on. We do experiments. We only do scientifically rigorous experiments in education. You'd be shocked at how unusual that is. And the things we rely on. What we are really doing, when you talk about rights in the beginning, we actually believe in the right to life outcomes, positive life outcomes. This is why we do education. So let me get you there. is where we started. I work with a guy named Roland Fryer, very interesting economics professor. He was born in poverty in Daytona Beach, Florida, raised by a drug dealer father, although his grandmother taught school in the segregated South, which I always find really fascinating. I want to interview this woman. In any event, he was raised mostly in Texas by his father, till his father was finally sent to prison when he was a young teenager. He was taken in by a coach at school. He was a football player, and his coach got him into a very small state college in Texas, where he was recognized as being rather bright in math by a professor who then picked him up and pushed him on. Where he pushed him on to was the second youngest person ever to make tenure at Harvard, and the youngest African American ever to make tenure at Harvard at 29. So he did fairly well in his 20s. He likes to say he never read a book until he went to college, and I actually believe him. Okay, so Roland likes to call him Roland, is Dr. Fryer. Any of the articles, and I do give you references to his articles here, but you just look up, Roland Fryer. Be sure to look at the one in Harvard, and look up his articles, because if you Google, you might pick up his father, who's a sex offender. That's not the one I work with. Okay, so what Roland decided when he made tenure, he calls tenure his early retirement. And he said, okay, so what am I going to do now that I'm tenured and I'm retired? What he decided is he really wanted to make a difference in life outcomes of minorities. He started off with black people. It's minorities, it's primarily low-income minorities that we work with in the United States. So he said, what do I care about in life outcomes? What do I think are indicia of a positive life experience? And he chose incarceration, wage rates. He actually chose, I didn't put it up here, but teen pregnancy rates, unemployment rates, and health rates. As you can see from one of his earliest studies, if you happen to be black in America, you're almost 3 times more likely to be incarcerated than if you're white. If you're black in America, you're likely to earn 72% on the dollar for similarly situated whites. If you're black in America, you're nearly 3 times as likely to be unemployed as your white counterparts, and you're significantly more likely to have bad life outcomes. What Dr. Fryer did then was he said, so if I look at every factor I can get my hands on with this population, what correlates to those outcomes? What can I find that will actually predict whether this black child or this white child is going to go to prison or is going to have life outcomes? What he found was, so if you took, so the numbers in the dark blue are, you take a random black child off the street, and you take a random white child off the street in the United States, and you predict out their futures, okay? If instead you take a pool of black children and white children who have the same test scores in 8th grade, and then you randomly select out a black child, and you randomly select out a white child, you get the differences go down to the blue, the light blue. Okay, so you go from being nearly 3 times as likely to be incarcerated to less than twice as likely. You go from having this enormous wage gap to having almost no wage gap. You go from having unemployment be 3 times as likely to being 2 times as likely. And health outcomes become almost insignificant. Okay, so that's where, you can go ahead and flip it. That's where we came to 8th grade test scores correlate to life outcomes. Okay, so when everybody talks to you about education and says test scores, we can't rely on test scores, until we find a better correlate, we rely on test scores. Okay, because our research has demonstrated 8th grade test scores correlate to these life outcomes we're trying to have an impact on. Okay, that's the article. Caution, this is correlative and not causational. That means that they do correlate. We're not really sure whether if we change the 8th grade test score, that's going to change life outcomes. I do have some really cool new data on a study that we haven't published yet that actually is a little more causation. We get funded, by the way, by that guy right down there. We love him. So you can go ahead. Okay, so what is the achievement gap? I just figured you might want to look at it. These are math NAEP scores. These are reading NAEP scores. They're fairly recent, last couple of years. You can see how poorly we educate our white children. And look at what we do with our minorities. Just look at what we do. It's mind-boggling to me. There's no jurisdiction among these large cities where 25%, 1 in 4 of our black kids are proficient in math. 1 in 4. 1 in 4. That's the best we can do. We love Cleveland. I love Cleveland. They have a really tiny achievement gap because they don't educate their white kids either. you gotta like them. They don't really have that big achievement gap that we worry about so much. Okay, go ahead. Okay, so minority students in the U.S. have lower standardized test scores on average than their white counterparts. Why? Dr. Fryer is black, thank God, so he gets to ask the hard questions, right? Okay, so that gives him a privilege. Go ahead. All right, so we'll do these really quickly because this is where I waste all my time. Maybe the achievement gap is accounted for by genetic differences. Nope, sorry. Did a study, it's an intelligence study on children, that's referenced to the paper, where the achievement gap is not evident till the age of 2, grows thereafter. Okay? It's not genetics. Go ahead. Oh, maybe they're just not motivated. You know, those kids, they're not motivated, they don't care. We went out and paid children across the country to do all kinds of things. Earn better test scores. We paid them to do their homework, show up for school, behave better. And we paid thousands of dollars. These kids could get thousands and thousands of dollars every year for these behaviors. Okay? What we found was the kids that we provided incentives for their inputs, okay, show up at school, do your homework, etc., had significantly higher test scores. The kids that we tried to pay to get good test scores couldn't do it. Didn't matter how much we offered them. It's like offering me $1 million to do brain surgery and that man over there. Okay, I can't do it. Now, what happens is, I have white skin, I'm educated in the United States, so I actually do know how to get there, right? I know I need to go back to college and do more science, and then I have to go to med school, and all that kind of good stuff. So at least I know how to get there. Our kids didn't in most of these schools. That's the reference to the paper. Maybe these out of school, environmental causes, all these kids are either mothered by somebody who is a drug addict or works 7 jobs. I don't know where those mothers are in between, but that's apparently what we think. We studied the Harlem Children's Zone. This is going to become relevant, so I'll get into this now. Okay, Harlem Children's Zone. Sorry, I'm talking fast. All right, Harlem Children's Zone. We have 96-block area in Harlem where if you live in that 96-block area, you get hyper social services. You get prenatal care, you get daycare, you get high-quality preschool, you get drug programs. I mean, you just have it all. You live in this 96-block area. That's Children's Zone. There are also schools, they're called the Promise Academies. One of them is from 6th to 8th grades. But unfortunately, they're oversubscribed, which means they have more applicants than they can actually take. The City of New York funds them. It's a public charter. All charters are public. Which means that they have to take from the whole City of New York. Okay, so what we get to study, so we just, as scientists, we just get really excited about this stuff. We get to study people who got in to the Harlem Children's Zone, people who didn't get in to the Harlem Children's Zone. Half of these live in the zone, and half of them don't. And half of these live in the zone, and half of them don't. Okay, you have to take my word, we did all these mathematical stuff. And they actually don't cheat on their lottery. Okay, they actually draw from slightly below the average minority kid who comes in the 6th grade. Okay, so we did this empirical study, which demonstrated, of course, now we're studying who got in, who didn't get in, you're in the zone, you're not in the zone. We found that the schools alone were closing the achievement gap. So whether or not you lived in the zone was not relevant. What was relevant is you went to the Promise Academy. Okay, you got the ticket. All right, so that's the article for that. Go ahead. All right, but now we've circled back, right? We've circled back to minority students are still not learning, not doing test scores the same rate as white students. Why is that? Okay, so, whoops, except in high-performing charters. So we've heard Kip mentioned, we studied HCZ, we've studied democracy prep, we've studied success charter networks. There are high-performing, so go ahead to the next one. There are high-performing charters. So this is in extra months of schooling. What you see, so the baseline is, excuse me, what you get if you were in the average public school in the United States for learning. These are extra months of schooling that you get in these different schools. Okay, so if you went to school for 9 months, in the average New York City charter, you'd actually get 10 months worth of learning, a little more than that. Okay, if you're in these 15 states, you're actually learning less than a year in a year of schooling. And now look at what we do. Harlem Children's Zone, that's their elementary school. This is their middle. These are the average mass charters, middle school, elementary schools. These are SEED. I don't know if you've heard of the SEED boarding school outside of DC, KIPP schools. All of them, you'll notice, have test scores that are closing the achievement gap. Okay? And this is a theme that will come through time and time again. We do far better in mathematics than we do in reading. Okay? We struggle a lot even with our model in reading. Okay, go ahead. But that means that somebody is educating minority poor kids. Okay, somebody knows how to do it. So we wanted to know if they know how to do it, let's go study them. Let's see what is it that these high-performing charters do. Now, the average charter school in the United States is actually no better than the average traditional public school. Okay, so we have this perfect storm situation where we have high-performing and low-performing, and we can study what do the high-performings do that the low-performings don't. Almost as interesting as what we did find is what we didn't find. Okay, so now remember, this is New York City charter schools. Okay, we're not studying traditional public schools. But what we found in these particular circumstances are class size did not make a difference. So whether if you're in a charter school in New York City, whether your class is small or large is not what drove the high test score outcome. Per pupil expenditure, we talked about Tom Boasberg and talking about money. We believe very much that extra money needs to be spent, but it really depends on how you spend it. And frankly, having been in the Providence public school system for a while, I would challenge that in 80% of our school districts, I can find you the money, because we waste money on things that don't have anything to do with student achievement. Teachers with no certification made no difference. Teachers with masters, this is where we waste a ton of money. Sorry, but it is. We actually found, this is the one place we found a slightly negative statistically significant. So you were slightly disadvantaged the more education your teacher had. But I suspect that has a lot more to do with the University of Phoenix than it does with real education, what you're getting here. Okay, so what we did find was statistically significant and correlate is, and go ahead to the next slide, be faster. In human capital management, it's the high frequency of instructional leaders in classrooms giving feedback to teachers that is used to change classroom practices, okay? Make that full circle. It's not somebody coming in a classroom and watching you teach. It's not somebody giving you harsh feedback that's unhelpful, okay? It's gotta be the full circle. It's a partnership between instructional leaders and classroom teachers. High dosage tutoring, this is the small individualized group work. You were talking about sort of, you have to have the supports for kids who are behind grade level. And we saw this time and time again at high performing charters. More instructional time in school, again, we heard the talk, it's extended school day, it's extended school week. That can include Saturday schools and extended school year. Data-driven instruction, Again, we have a full circle here. It is regular data that's related to a relevant curriculum, synthesized so that teachers can understand it, and they use it to change pacing and structure in their classrooms. High expectations, which again, you've heard. High expectations in our instance, mercy, was every teacher and every leader holds himself accountable.
I won't hold you to
Keep going. Okay, so what makes the successful charter school successful are these 5 tenets. There's the paper. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to run through quickly where we've been. 8th grade test scores, high correlate to important life outcomes. Minority students, lower test scores than their white counterparts. The differences are not explained by traditional excuses such as genetic differences, motivational differences, or out-of-school issues. Successful charter schools graduate minority students with test scores that are not lower than their white counterparts. And we explain the difference in these high-performing charters from low-performing charters with these 5 habits or practices. So then the question is, we can't educate all of our kids in charter schools. Okay, if we actually enrolled all of our kids in charters, we wouldn't get them in charters at current growth rates until 2050. And that begs the question of high-performing charters. Okay, so just charters are just not going to happen in my lifetime, which is not good enough. So what if we implement with fidelity, which turns out to be a really important part of that, these 5 practices in a traditional public school, will we get the same results? So we wanted to know. So, keep going. That brought us to Houston's Apollo 20. I'm going to describe everything here based on Houston. We actually do the same work in Denver. It's in a little bit of an administratively different structure. So we actually have a administrative partner who actually does a lot of the work in Denver, but they use the model that I'm talking with you about here. And I'll show you the success at the end. But this happens to be Houston. Okay, I've got not enough time, so just take my word for it. We implemented these various things that are relevant and that we described as the 5 tenets, including 2-to-1 student ratios and tutoring in math in 4th, 6th, and 9th grades. And that's embedded in the school day, okay? It's not this sort of after-school afterthought. This is, I come to school every day. I have tutoring every day at 3rd period. I have the same tutor. I have somebody else in my class who's at the exact same level as I am. And we're working 2-on-1 with a tutor who's pacing our curriculum in the classroom roughly a week and a half behind. Okay? So that I'm falling behind in math. My math teacher calls my tutor and says, June had trouble with X, Y, and Z. Can you be working with her in this small group setting to shore up what she's got? What does that do for me? Because I don't fall behind. I don't fall behind because I'll never catch up. If you don't understand how to add, you can't add fractions. You can't multiply fractions. You can't do anything because you've lost this one tiny little nugget back in the 6th grade. Okay. These were the results. I should have done a drum roll. Okay, so what we did, you'll see in our tutoring grades, this is our first year. So first year we were only working middle and high schools. These are the worst performing schools in Houston. We were allowed to work in them because they were up to be taken over by the state. And so the second year, we added 11 elementaries. We were permitted by Houston to randomize. So we took their 22 lowest performing schools and we randomly selected half of them to work in. And this is what we got. So there actually is lots of literature showing the returns that you get from smaller class sizes. From 1972, now we've gone from roughly 23.4 teachers per student to just over 15. That reduction in class size, incredibly expensive, yielded a 0.2 standard deviation of additional education levels. And roughly, if you divide this by 0.8, you're going to get the extra months of schooling. So if you decrease the class size that dramatically, you're going to get roughly 2 and a little bit extra months of schooling in a school year. Okay? These are the effects we got. On a pooled basis, we had almost a 0.3 standard deviation. When you went to high schools, we were incredibly successful. In the high schools particularly, where we have almost a 0.4 standard deviation, you can see what happens in the grades that we do tutoring in. These are the math schools. Okay, go ahead. This is how we compare to those high-performing charters that we talked about earlier. So you can see these are your Denver, you guys call them the Summit schools here. They're in the northeast, west, like that. Anyway, so you see your average New York City charter. This is the Harlem Children's Zone. This is KIPP, which you've heard about. These are the Apollo Middle Schools, the Apollo Elementary Schools, and this is Denver. This is the success of the Denver schools. So we are now rivaling in traditional public schools the kinds of gains that you can see in charter schools, and we're doing it at a rate that we could actually replicate and close the gap. Okay. Return on investment. Sorry, we're economists, so everything has to do with money. This is actually a return on investment. So the way that we calculate this for the mathematicians in the room, we will actually multiply out the additional income earned or projected to be earned by kids with higher test scores. We then tax it. We calculate the tax on it, and then we discount it back to present value. That's how we come up with return on investment. And you'll see the no excuses charter schools are roughly slightly over 18%. The Apollo schools are coming in right about the same if you average them, as is Denver. The Denver summer schools also. So this is what we do for politicians to demonstrate you need to spend money to make money. And this is the way that if you don't care about kids and you don't care about your community, surely you care about how many taxes they're going to be paying in some way. Okay. This is one of the most exciting things I think that we have going. So I talked about the Harlem Children's Zone before. This is my last slide, I promise. I talked about the Harlem Children's Zone. So we have kids who got in, kids who didn't get in, right? Half are from the neighborhood, half are not. Half of the neighborhood, half are not. The kids who enter the 6th grade, the 6th through 8th grade, okay, so they came in from New York City traditional schools, and they went from 9th to 12th grade in New York City traditional public schools. Okay, we only had them for 3 years in Harlem Children's Zone. But the first cohort of 6th graders just graduated from high school at the end of last year. So we wanted to know, what's the difference between the kids who got in, whether they were in the neighborhood or not, and what's the difference for the kids who did not get in, neighborhood or not? Okay? This is what makes me, I'm sorry, pardon my French, pisses me off. This is not okay. The kids who got into the Harlem Children's Zone were nearly 15% more likely to go to college, and 22% more likely to go to a 4-year college, which makes a big difference in life outcome. And on the Woodcock-Johnson, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, the kids who got in did nearly 30% better on math. We continue to struggle with reading. Charters struggle, we struggle. So the other piece of the lab that I really haven't talked about, we do a lot of experimentation on what we can do with reading to improve these scores. Health outcomes is the one place where, remember I said half were in the neighborhood? Okay, the half that were in the neighborhood, regardless of which school they went to, had better health outcomes. So if this is your goal, to have better health outcomes, you need to get out of education and go into neighborhood services, okay? Because that makes a huge difference to health outcomes. But these are what sends me right into the stratosphere. So if you don't get in, if you don't get a ticket to the Harlem Children's Zone, and you're a girl, you are nearly 5 times more likely to be pregnant by the time you're 18. 5 times. 5 times. That's my kid, sitting in that chair right there. That's my daughter. She doesn't get that ticket. She is 5 times more likely to be pregnant by the time she's 18. If that's my son, he's 3 times more likely to go to prison. By the age of 18, this is what we do by not educating our children, then it's not okay. I know I'm singing to the choir here. But I'm glad to be here. And I'm glad you guys are doing this. Thanks.
See, I don't get particularly nasty. I was just threatening.
I noticed I didn't even look at you.
Yeah, I know. Working hard to avoid my gaze. So I want to thank you all very much for your different perspectives. And you know, there are some things that occurred to me. We'll be taking questions for a while. I applaud the Ford Foundation's interest in community college, by the way. I'm a member of AAUP, which that's the American Association of University Professors, who somehow were perceived of as this radical unionist group, which we're not, but it's the perception. But I remember going to a regional meeting, and you know, I'm moaning and groaning about the fact that I don't think I'm getting paid enough, and then I start talking to my colleagues who are community college, and I have to say that I was almost embarrassed to say that I felt like I wasn't being paid enough, and I was appalled and deeply concerned. So while so there's the interesting getting students to at least a community college, but then what do they get when they get there? They're getting, I think my colleagues are incredibly underpaid and phenomenally overworked. So I have a deep concern about the instructors who are there. I think they're doing they must be incredibly devoted, but their lifespan in a sense must be short, and they must be looking for something else. Being an assistant manager at Mattress King pays far more than being a full-time instructor at almost any community college in Colorado. So I hope the Ford Foundation is also looking at that part of the equation as well.
Watch for the report. It's going to come out in June.
Good, good. I am looking for it. I'm looking forward to it. I'm also interested in looking at your senior fellow program and what all that has been about. I wonder for others as well is, again, I'm reflecting back on my youngest son who's going to Denver School of Science and Technology, which is a kind of a charter school, but it's part of the Denver public school system. My son is in the 4th campus. They're about to build 2 more. They have huge amounts of private money coming into it because it's science and technology. So you get, that name is attached to then private investment. And he's in the first year of a class called College View, and they're getting this brand new, beautiful, state-of-the-art middle school followed by a high school. But there's an incredible amount of discipline. I was curious about that because I went to parochial schools, and because I needed to go to parochial schools. And they have that there, and they had what you talked about, goals. I was thinking about, because it's been hammered into the parents too, and I actually remembered them because the core values are respect, responsibility, integrity, courage, curiosity, and doing your best. These kids start at 7:30 in the morning. They get out at 4. They spend the first hour talking about these goals and what it means to, in the day to come and in their daily lives at home. If you forget to do a single, math problem, you stay at school for an hour afterwards doing college prep. If you break a single rule, like talking in the hallways between classes, you have to do a refocus. So I'm curious about what you think about this kind of discipline. We wear uniforms and all this other kinds of things. All these things I'm used to from parochial school education, but rarely see in the public school. And if that has had, I didn't see that here, if that kind of thing has an impact. 20 of the students, 6th grade students, are not going to be able to go to 7th grade next year. They're being forced to repeat 6th grade. I've never heard of that in public schools. But they basically say, this is your choice. You either have to go someplace else, or your student has to repeat. I mean, that's something that was done in a generation actually before mine, but I haven't seen in a long time. Is that helpful? And finally, I want to applaud the work that you're doing. It is so nice, from my perspective, to see serious research methodology being applied to education. I have to tell you, as a human rights guy, it's appalling the level of research. And I work a lot on forced labor and human trafficking, and the methodology is non-existent. The data is completely unreliable, and there's no transparency. So we're making serious policy issues based on junk science. And I've had the impression sometimes over the years that sometimes we are making serious education choices based on junk science too. So I want to say I'm delighted to hear that you are not engaging in that. In fact, trying to really raise the bar in understanding. Of course, translating this to politicians is not a job that that most of us do or even do well, so I applaud you for doing that. So if you would like to comment on any of that, but also take questions, I try to make your, unlike what I just did, okay, try to make your questions short, sweet, and to the point. But if I'd be interested in hearing your reflections on anything my comments. It's what moderators do, by the way, sort of wrap. So, yeah,
well,
go
I can
ahead.
say, sorry, our opinion on discipline is merely an opinion. What we've found in the schools that we've actually implemented the 5 tenets in, if you educate kids and you have high expectations for them, you'll be surprised what they live up to. So we tend to find it's really funny, so we're going into some new schools this year and some new districts. We continually get the question of what is your disciplinary policy? We don't have one. Our disciplinary policy is if you entertain the kids, and learning is very entertaining. It really is if it's done right. But if you're teaching those kids, they're going to be learning. It's really something to see. It's hard to describe, but one thing clearly follows the other. We work with a woman in the Success Academies in Harlem. She does a couple of experiments with this right now. And her philosophy is if I come into your class and consistently there are kids goofing off, I'm going to sit in the back and find out why. Because the why is the teaching, it's not the kid.
Well, the schools that we were at, there are very different types of discipline policies, but and the focus is on learning. It's not so much that kids have to sit up straight and be quiet all the time and all of that, but that they need to be engaged in learning. And taking learning seriously requires a culture shift. And how you do that, of course, can vary tremendously. The KIPP schools are known for their discipline. They are known as schools where essentially if you're not involved in learning, and this is a big one, if you're actually distracting other students so that they don't have the right to learn, you're interrupting their right to learn essentially, you're going to pay a price for that. So for example, you'll be standing in the back of the class with your jersey turned, backwards or something like that, which is, in most public schools, that's not acceptable. That would be looked at as embarrassing, right? And that would not be allowed. Public schools are very fearful of lawsuits. So those types of things are hard to do. And now the KIPP schools, there's a contract. So the parent signs it, as does the student, that you will, and as do teachers actually, there are certain modes of behavior that everybody agrees to. And yeah, if you're getting behind, you're going to be staying after. You're not going to be part of the orchestra. So the famous KIPP, the most famous, which is in the Bronx, it's also in Harlem actually. They have probably the best orchestra you'll ever hear anywhere. And the reason is it's the only extracurricular activity they have at school. It's the one outlet for the kids other than academics. And this is one of the KIPPs are highly controversial for this reason. It's focused entirely on academics. Arts are not highly valued, okay? So, and it's a tough love approach, just put it very simply. So some people look at that and have criticized it, and they also advocate for the kids to, once they finish at KIPP, to go to an Ivy League school, to leave the community and not necessarily come back. And many have criticized them as culturally insensitive and not affirming in that approach. And again, controversial, but it's their model, and they stand by it.
Annie?
I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what you have to say in terms of test scores, because I know there's the recent controversy in Atlanta talking about falsifying test scores and the importance of getting that high school diploma. but also using them as critical benchmarks for success, like grades 4, 6, and 9, and using them to gauge students' progress. And so on the one side, you have teachers who are saying you're only teaching the test score, it's not a fair measurement of their true abilities, and now especially in light of Race to the Top and tying so much into funding teacher effectiveness. Do you think that detracts from learning, or what do you think the future of standardized test scores is? Is it okay as it presently exists, or does it need some sort of hearing or reform to get a better view of an accurate portrayal of the education of the individual?
So there's a new study that I just read about in the last week that demonstrates that the more frequently students are tested, the more they actually remember the material that they want. Our philosophy is that it depends on the test. If it's a bad test, then don't teach to it. But if it's the right test, for God's sake, you should be teaching to it. Hello? I mean, if that's what we're going to say is what the kids are supposed to be learning, as long as that's what they're supposed to be learning, it should be acceptable. That being said, your standardized test score should never, ever be a surprise to anybody. So what we require in our schools that we work in is that there are benchmarks. We get benchmarks at least every 6 weeks. The data comes back to us in the lab. We actually spit it back to the teachers very quickly in a readable format so that they can use it to have sit-downs one-on-ones with their kids and set goals for the next time they have a benchmark. One of my favorite schools in the universe is in this really small town in Rhode Island called Cumberland. It's Cumberland, Rhode Island. It's Blackstone Valley. They give something called an exit ticket, which a number of charter schools do. Exit tickets are, it's a 3 quick question at the end of every class. You reserve the last 3 minutes of every class for the 3 quick question, and you actually reserve time for the, the PRIDE, whatever that stands for, because that's the school thing. But you give that, and actually they structure it so that the first question is fairly simple, and the third question requires higher level thinking. So they can very quickly, as a teacher, you run through, you know exactly what it is that the kids have gotten. You know how many kids are at the higher level thinking. If you've got a significant number, you've only got maybe 2 kids who didn't get questions 1 and 2, you need to talk to their tutors or you need to work with them after school. If you've got 80% who didn't get number 3, it means you need to reteach. And they actually set aside 5 minutes of the following class, which is designed to reteach what the kids didn't pick up. The way that we do it in our Houston and Denver schools is we actually have, within tutoring, we have a schedule, or scope and sequence actually stops at the end of 13 days, and then there's a test day, and then there's a relearning day. And so you're constantly building into your own scope and sequence a relearning, so that you're constantly making sure that your kids are catching up or keeping up.
Can I just make one quick addendum to that? My response to that has always been that I totally believe that we should always have test scores as a variable. Because my only fear is if we use it as the only sole variable to determine a child's proficiency, when you disaggregate down to the individual test score, there's a high degree of volatility. Any good psychometrician will tell you that. And so therefore, it's important and critical that we do the very, very hard work of trying to figure out what are the other necessary variables that give us a much more comprehensive picture of that child's proficiency. So one of the things that we're trying to do right now in our place-based work around quarters of college success is we've invested in this organization called Strive, which has done a lot of work around trying to put together comprehensive data management systems so that you have an opportunity to monitor children's progress to and through these very important transitions. So it does include the school data in terms of the test scores, but it also includes other kinds of variables that others would consider civic analytics. So it goes beyond it. So in addition to the test score, I think we have to do the very hard critical work of trying to figure out a much more comprehensive set of variables for a larger, more authentic picture. I mean, that's just my personal thing. And of course, we're giving money to it, but So, and we're giving money to you too, so it's all
Yeah,
good.
we love it. Well, we continue to use that money to look for other better correlates
Right.
For life outcomes, because that's really our goal, is those life outcomes. And so that's always critical to know what are the non-cogs that go into successful life outcomes.
Right.
But I can tell you that if you've got Einstein and he's not doing well in the 8th grade, there's something wrong with the teaching. Okay? It's not Einstein. All right? So when you, it should be a trigger. It should be a hint that there's something going on. Obviously, there's very high variation among kids. You can't rely on any one test score and say, you know, this is not the SAT. You're either smart or you're dumb based on your, you know, based on your score. But it is something that should trigger in you, what is happening with this child? That they're not able to interpret whatever it is that they're learning in the school day into those test scores.
Yeah, I just wanted to voice a concern about some of this data. I worked in New York City Public Schools as a teacher for 3 years in public schools and then for 1 year in a charter school. I lived in Harlem, and I walked by the Harlem Children's Zone like every day, like right there in Harlem. But just a couple of things. Just in my experience, when I moved from teaching in New York City public schools to the charter schools, when I was teaching in public schools, I had 60 to 70% of my kids had IEPs and were English language learners. When I moved to the charter school, I had 5 kids in my whole class who had IEPs, and they had a ton of support. So the charter school, I find through either tacit or explicit screening processes can get the kids who are more socialized, whose parents are more involved, who don't have those kinds of extra needs. So there's that. There's also, I have a lot of trouble sometimes with charter schools, especially Jeffrey Canada himself said that he's the guy who founded Harlem Children's Zone. He sometimes can resort to teacher bashing when it comes to when people are trying to explain why is your school so successful, and he says if the teacher's not working, they're out. And I just think that there's this, teachers are often used as scapegoats for these problems, and there's a lot of really, really good teachers out there and a lot of really good potential teachers out there who people give up on too quickly, who with just a little bit of support could be excellent, sustainable teachers. And I mean, I taught for 4 years. I burned out after 4 years because of the lack of support, and I really like teaching. So I just want to put a caution out there when it comes to talking about the teaching and the teachers, that it's not always that they're bad teachers. Sometimes they just don't have the right support.
So I completely agree that you have to have the full circle of, when you've got an instructional leader in a classroom, you have to have the full circle of they're in a true partnership with their teachers, so that they're coming in and they're observing in order to give constructive feedback so the teacher can use it in the classroom. As far as ESL, we actually, I would love to predict who you used to work with. There are some charters that we don't, their data is inconsistent with a true lottery. So we know when the kids come in that they're not at the right levels. That's not the Harlem Children's Zone. They actually, we suspect that it's because of their communication model that they particularly, they have a high push for in the lower income neighborhoods. They get kids that are slightly below the level, but there are other charter schools who we can do an analysis that they're entering classes and we know that they've cheated on their entry.
Well, I think it was a screening process. It was more that the kids come in in 5th grade and they have to go through an application process, but everyone in New York has to apply to schools. So the parents that had the most involvement, that had the most language skills, that had the most resources were the ones who were able to apply to this charter school. That's my experience with charter schools. I don't know if Harlem Children's Zone the same way, if they need parents to be applying.
When we study the differences, we start with the parents who were able to fill out the application.
Yeah.
So we only start with the people who qualified for the lottery, which means they should all be in the same place when they begin. And the only difference is whether you get the ticket or not. There are charter schools for whom that's not true. When you see the data though from Houston and from Denver as well, those schools are, well, Denver kind of cheated. Because Denver actually stopped their schools and then started back up again, so they pick up the 6th grade and then they, graduate to a 7th grade. In Houston, we actually took over the schools, kids, everything, same. Nothing changed in the building. We did lose some teachers. That was mostly their own choice. But we did, encourage some teachers to leave. The firm belief now, we do a number of studies right now on how to get good teachers to great teachers and how to get mediocre teachers to good teachers. We cannot cut our way to the top here. There just aren't enough. There's no hidden drawer with all the great teachers in it, right? We don't have it. We've got to educate our teachers in a way that's effective for student outcomes. That being said, our experiments are always, if you do a teacher PD, we only calculate how the students do on their test scores from the teacher who's got the PD. I really appreciate whether or not the teacher really loved the PD and thinks it's helpful, but frankly, that doesn't do anything for the kids.
I was just going to say also in our study, this was a key piece that schools invested in teachers. And there's no cutting corners here, that's clear. Unfortunately, it's taken the country years to understand this, as professional development just now is beginning to receive the attention it really, it's hard to imagine this, but we have not made this a focal point in the U.S. Investing in teachers, investing in training significantly over many years, and there are no shortcuts, absolutely. Teachers have got to know their content, and they've got to learn how to teach it well.
So what I kept thinking about when you were explaining that is parents who want to apply and that are in the same place, that really only considers parents who really, I'm not saying parents don't care for their children, but parents who are maybe not working 7 jobs, or parents who have the time, or some parents just don't care, some parents use drugs, some parents, so that really just, it cuts out a very large group of students who could be excellent subjects for this. And is there any way that you can involve those parents, complete applications for them, encourage them to apply? Has that been considered?
So instead of doing that, what we've determined is that we'd rather work in traditional public schools. We'd rather figure out what the formula is that we can implement in traditional public schools so that parents don't have to apply to get their kids. They don't have to speak English. They don't have to be able to fill out an application. They don't have to be aware. They don't have to have the time. One of the things that we talk about, again, when we get the disciplinary question from schools that we work with, we also get the, how do you involve parents? We don't. Why do we not? As a part of our model. Now, principals do what principals do. We don't because I can't change these kids' parents. I can't change that they're in a single parent household. I can't change that they come from poverty. I can't change that they spend money on a Wii instead of books. I can't change that. What I can change is the school. We've demonstrated through serious, rigorous scientific study that schools can make the difference in these kids' lives. Schools alone. I can't change their parents, but I can certainly change the schools they go to, and that will change their lives.
Thank you for the question in the way.
Yeah, I was just wondering, having been accepted to the University of Denver master's program, hearing that master's doesn't really help in the outcome. It's really...
That's on average.
Well, actually, there's research that shows if it's in a content area, it does make a difference.
Yeah,
for science and
that's
math.
good.
For science and math.
But I was just wondering, it sounds like there's a lot of emphasis on the teachers, and I know that in a lot of the presentation it talked about how to better teach children and how to get them involved. But what do you think of like how can we help teachers rather than just showing statistics, I guess?
So here's one of the things I think it's really important for you to remember. In this country, in the vast majority of our school districts, we pay teachers significantly more to have a bachelor's plus 30, a master's plus 30, or PhD. Okay? So when you look at these statistics, you have to look behind the numbers. The vast majority of people with master's degrees got them because they wanted the money. Okay? Not because they wanted the education. Not because they thought it would make them a better teacher. Not because they were trying to reach out to their students. Okay? So you can't, please don't take the statistics as you should never have a master's degree. You can't be a better teacher if you have a master's degree. That would be ridiculous, right? It depends on who you are and what you're trying to accomplish with that education, okay? So what can you do? Be a better teacher. Make sure that your master's degree is making you a better teacher.
It's relevant to what you're doing.
The PD is critical. We spend billions of dollars in this country on professional development. We haven't the foggiest notion if it makes any difference to kids' outcomes. None. None. We're doing a study now, so we're in the study. Before we start studies, we do the lit reviews. The lit review showed something that we found 400 and some odd studies in the last 10 years on teacher PD. 2 of them calculated positive outcomes based on anything other than the teacher's opinion of the PD. 2 out of 400 and something. That's ridiculous. Is that what we're really trying to do with teacher PD? We're trying to make teachers happy?
I just wanted to, so being a math educator, I have to put in my 2 cents here.
But you are right, and so that is true.
Well, in math education, this has become a focal area of study in the last decade, really. I mean, we are still really in a very early stage of understanding what very good PD means for teachers, but I think there are a few things that we have learned. Content that's very much related to what teachers are teaching, which is exactly what you were getting at. So the PD needs to be related to what teachers are doing, what they're teaching, and also how to teach it well. The other, and this comes back to your question, is the assessment piece. So we know from some very good studies that when teachers know how to use assessment strategies, not just testing, but assessment in a broader sense, looking at students' thinking, listening to students, and so forth, and then basing instruction on that. So, we see what students can do and where they're weak. That helps me be a better teacher. When I begin to learn how to do those types of things in the classroom, my test scores go up. My learning increases, test scores go up. So quality PD, we do have models out there. We're getting to a place where we're beginning to understand it much better. Very much connected to what teachers do in the classroom, what a concept, right? And I think a big part of the problem, frankly, has been that so much of what goes on out there is not helpful for teachers in their day-to-day and what they actually do with students.
Right.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to the very last thing that you had said before Q&A, which was to talk about going beyond the reading. What happens when we go on beyond the reading and math subjects? Because I'm looking at these Woodcock-Johnson and all of these things that are on, that was in your presentation, June, and what I'm seeing is that the math scores, that something's going right with the math scores, and the reason that it seems to be going right with the math scores, to me, correlating to the teach to the test, is that there is a right answer in a math score. In a reading score, maybe there's comprehension that is right or that isn't, but it occurs to me that there's so many other subjects that won't be caught in those things. What do we do? Do we ignore those at the 6th and 8th grade levels and only worry about them later? Do we, how do we deal with these other subjects that I believe, at least as a history philosophy undergraduate background, think are crucially important? How do we understand what the outcome is for these sorts of subjects to the life outcomes that were so important, that we're all focused on?
Everyone's looking at me. Well, this really goes to this whole issue, at least with us in the community college work. I mean, there are different types of structures that we like to see happening in community colleges. And one of the things that lots of governors have talked about is this issue of, aligning the work that happens in community colleges and four-year institutions to workforce and employment. So it's the same kind of thing. And then you hear all that stuff about, well, we need more STEM. And so therefore we have to align and I actually agree that we should figure out ways to align the work that goes on in some colleges and universities to the regional labor market needs. But we don't necessarily have to do that. It's not a either or as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I think we should also be engaged in the holistic education of children, particularly, and older adults and non-traditional, which are now traditional, including, supporting public service pathways in community colleges so that people can be civically engaged. And so I think that we have to be very careful about how we frame this and to say, okay, well, but we know in community colleges, for example, the biggest thing that trips them up is math. But at the same time, we have to think of it not just as sort of a piecemeal kind of thing, but how do we design a comprehensive approach to the education of children and adults and students that goes so that we're thinking in a much more comprehensive way. Now, you see I'm a comprehensive kind of guy here, right? I mean, I know. When I said the test score should be one variable, which should get other civic analytics that go along with it. So it gets to the question of this. What is the purpose of education?
Right.
And I think we should always ask ourselves that question. What is the purpose of education? And then from there to begin to think about what is the actual kind of curriculum that is aligned with what we truly believe is a well-rounded, educated person. That's just my own little philosophy on that. That might not mean a hill of beans, but I'm throwing it out there.
So it's interesting because when you were talking about backward mapping, so I want to read something to you, which is like, we got this about 3 days ago. So we're running this horse race in a couple schools, and in 20 schools actually, no, 11. In 11 schools, where we've got one person who's doing teacher professional development for second grade teachers on a reading program. The woman who's running this believes very, very strongly that you need to teach teachers their content area, that the reason teachers can't actually teach reading is because they can't teach a theme of a book because they don't actually know the theme of the book, okay? And so that's her strong philosophy. Then there's always Doug Lemov, so he's teaching fourth grade teachers how to do the Lemov method, okay, how to just reach kids, because Doug Lemov is all about, teachers come in knowing what they know, and that's really great, but if they just knew how to teach, engage the kids, that would make the big difference, okay? So we're doing this horse race with these things. So in the second grade, where we have this teacher who believes that this is one of the, we just got somebody sent from one of our elementary schools. So this is a second grader who did this little essay. And the question was, why is Charlotte so determined to save Wilbur's life? This is Charlotte's Web, obviously. Even though her health is failing. Second grader, here's the answer. I think Charlotte is still saving Wilbur's life because Charlotte and Wilbur have a special and deep friendship. Charlotte is mothering Wilbur. She loves Wilbur and doesn't want their friendship to end so soon. Even though Charlotte is ill, she's still determined to save Wilbur's life. Wilbur's like a son to her, and she doesn't want him to be cooked in a bacon. Okay, so until you get to the bacon part, it's hard to know that's a second grader. That's pretty high level thinking. That's a reading program. If that doesn't create a philosopher, in college I'll eat my hat. And that, I think, is where we're going, is these core skills do create environments where kids can flourish and they can learn what it is that they're really great at, whether that's STEM, whether that's philosophy, whether that's strategic thinking, or thinking outside the box.
But I also think we have to be really serious about, I'll go back to my first thing, developing comprehensive ways to assess students, because otherwise what's going to end up happening is it's going to become more and more and more and more narrow based on how we assess. So And actually, I have to go to have dinner with some grantees, so this is a big trip, so I have to.
I'm going to bring this to a close and thank our panelists, because I know there's always what's also fun besides the presentation and the formal Q&A is the ability to sort of come up and ask your questions individually and have that kind of interaction for those of you who can hang out and do that. So please join me in thanking our panelists.